Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fieldhouse Museum Speaker Series, Beautifully Bound Books. My name is Nicole Meyer, and I'm the curator here at the Eugene Field Library and at the Fieldhouse Museum located in downtown St. Louis. We are really excited to bring to you a wonderful partnership program today with Cassie Brand of the Washington University Libraries, who will be showing you some of the finely bound books within their collection. And to start things off, I just wanted to tell you a little bit and share some of the things that we have going on here in our library. Right now, closing at the end of the week, we have our book binding exhibit that takes a look at books bound between 1850 and 1950 during life and height of Eugene Field's popularity. Eugene Field was an avid book collector as well as a newspaper man and a poet. From Sharps and Flats Volume 1, he has been quoted as the writer of Sharps and Flats requests that publishers and authors seem to no more paper-covered books. He simply throws away all books of this kind, it being his notion that a book that is worth reading is surely worth keeping, and it is therefore entitled to a durable dress. And behind me, you will note that we do have, these are some of the beautifully bound books that Eugene Field himself collected, as well as the library's copy of the 1875 Compton Dry. Just one of the books that we have on display is part of our 12-volume set. This particular book was bound in 1896 with Moroccan leather, and it is one of only 10 sets in existence and has hand illuminated pages inside as well as the gold gilding on top. So we are very lucky to have this within our collection. And today you'll be seeing more books bound like this and with even more extravagance from Cassie. So Cassie is curator of rare books at Washington University Libraries in St. Louis, where she works with amazing collections ranging from 3000 BC to present. Her favorite part of the job is sharing rare books with others through outreach programs, teaching classes, and exhibits. Her research focuses on intersection of the books as a physical and cultural object, and focuses on the histories of the book collecting in libraries. In whatever spare time she can find, she is working on a PhD. Her dissertation, which is in progress, is entitled How Books Became Rare, The History of Special Collections in America, 1880 to 1940. If there's any questions during this presentation, you can comment to the side, and we will be sure to be monitoring them, and we'll answer questions at the end. So then, I'm going to go ahead and turn this on over to Cassie.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you all for coming. A big thank you to the Fieldhouse for having me today. When Nicole told me about the Eugene Field quote about books being bound beautiful, I was very excited because I absolutely love bindings. I find them to be incredibly fascinating, especially with the history of how things are bound, which I'm going to be talking about in a little bit. I want to give just a little bit of an overview of the collections here at Washington University Libraries. The rare book collections is one of the collecting areas. We also collect local history, university archives, modern literature, modern graphic history, and film and media. The rare book collections range, as Nicole said, from 3000 BC with our Cuneiform Tablets to the present. We are still collecting books that are being made currently. And we have about 70,000 different books. So what you're seeing today is a very, very, very small sample of our collections. And I pretty much picked my favorites, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited to share these with all of you today. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to start with the earliest codex in our collection. When I say codex, that is the term for the book that we think of, that has two covers and pages in between. So this book was handwritten because it predates the standardized use of printing, at least in Europe, and it is from around 1275. Now, the binding was done a little bit later and is from the 14th century. So not necessarily a pretty binding, but I think a really fascinating one, especially because it is so early. You can see it was bound in leather and it's been kind of worn down. It almost feels like a suede. You can see here the bands on which the pages were sewn and attached that you can see on the inside here. And then this is actual wood board, which I love that you can see that inside. So just a really fabulous early binding. Again, not quite pretty, but so early that it's really fascinating. Now, one of the main reasons you would bind a book is to protect it. And this is one of our most protective bindings that we have in the collection. This is from around 1488. And this binding is what we call contemporary. And when I use the word contemporary, that means that it was bound around the time that the book was printed. So not bound later, but contemporary to that printing. And the reason that this is important is because books are bound and rebound so often throughout the life of the book. And this is because bindings can be easily damaged. Any part that moves, especially this front hinge, is going to be the first part that gets damaged and needs to be replaced. And so a lot of people would rebind their books as that binding became worn over time, or they wanted a prettier one. Another really important thing about the history of bookbinding is that until we get to industrialization, books are bound by the people who buy them. So you would walk into your bookshop and you would pick up a stack of pages and buy that text block. And then you would take it to the binder, sometimes in the back of the print shop. Sometimes you might have a personal binder if you have that many books and that much money. And you go to that binder and you tell the binder what you want. And so for this book, this is Summa Angelica, which is canon law. They wanted it to be incredibly protected. So they did lots of different protective things, including these clasps. So this would keep the book shut so that the book doesn't expand and keeps the humidity out. You have this metal furniture. These bosses lift the book up off of the table so that, or keep it away from other books so that there's no rubbing of the pigskin that you can see here. And then you have the corners protected from being bumped or damaged. And then you have this really fantastic blind tooling where a design was pressed in to this pigskin binding to add further decoration. And that is simply pretty and not functional in any way. But the absolute best part of the book is this chain. So this is originally part of a chained library in which a rod would go through this part of the chain and literally chain this book to the shelf as an anti-theft device. And so you would have kind of a desk right in front of the shelf that you could put the book on and stand there and read it. And only the librarian or whoever was in charge of these books would be able to unlock it and take that book anywhere else. This makes interdisciplinary study really difficult, but is a great anti-theft device. If you can't remove the book from the shelf, you can't take it with you. And again, you've got this really fantastic wood board that's covered in the pigskin just to give it that extra like heft and might to make sure that this book really lasts for a very long time. And as you can see, it has. It looks pretty brand new, pretty untouched. And since it's canon law, it probably wasn't read very heavily, but was important to have around. So that's one of my favorites in the collection. So that would have been a very expensive binding. And I want to talk about some inexpensive bindings as well, just to give you a little bit of context on the different options that people would have when they're going in to choose their binding. So I have two books here that are actually recycled bindings. So this one you can see very clearly. They just used an old printed page and used that for the binding covering. On the inside, you can see, because the binding has broken just a little bit, that they're using it there too. So this would be kind of your cheapest option. If you're a poor scholar, you could go in and say, bind this as cheaply as you can, and they would use whatever was lying around the shop. This one, you can see kind of faintly old writing that runs this way along the book. So this is what is known as a palimpsest. This is vellum that was written on, and vellum is an animal skin that was often used in manuscript production as the writing surface before printing kind of made a switch to paper. And so vellum is thick enough that after you've written on it, you can scrape off most of what was written. And that's what happened here in order to reuse this piece of vellum for this binding. And this is kind of your early form of paperback. And you can see it's been repaired and conserved, but it's a nice, flexible vellum, and it's what we refer to as a limp vellum binding. And this would have been your cheapest option. It's also referred to as a scholar's binding because scholars never had quite a lot of money for books like some of the richer people with the more beautiful bindings would. And speaking of really beautiful bindings, this is one that I actually don't bring out very often because it is so fragile and it is so damaged, but it was quite common, especially for women, to bind their books in beautiful fabrics such as this velvet, which looked like it was a nice, possible like burgundy color at one point before it faded. And this is one of our illuminated manuscript books of hours. It has those really fantastic clasps. These actually latch, and you can turn that piece there in order to lock it in place. I have to unlock, there we go. And so this is just a really beautiful, but very fragile type of binding. And it's amazing that it's still intact and wasn't rebound later. So this is a case in which the owner decided that making this book beautiful was more important than keeping it really protected and safe, and not having to replace that binding anytime soon, like that chained book. Another form of bindings that were often used by women would be embroidered bindings, such as this miniature book here. So you can see it's different threads and some sequins that have been applied. And you might have professionals doing this, but you might also have women creating their own embroidered bindings for their books. This was a common practice, and there were different patterns and techniques that they could use in order to create their own beautiful binding. This is another miniature book with a different type of embroidery. And this one is much later, I believe it's 20th century, yep. But just still really beautifully done and unique. And one of the reasons you would want a book that was so beautifully bound is because you might do something like this with a different type of chain. And so this chain isn't meant to be attached to a shelf. It's meant to be attached to your belt. And so you could carry it around, attached to your belt. This was especially common in terms of prayer books that you were supposed to have with you so that you knew what to pray throughout the day. And it was a really fantastic way, especially with a really gorgeous binding, that you could show off not only how educated you are because you have a book, but how wealthy you are because you could afford a book, but also how pious you are because you have a religious book that's attached to your belt and with you at all times. And so it was kind of a three-fer in which people could show off their wealth, intelligence, and piety, all by having a beautifully bound book. Being able to carry around a book is another reason that you would want clasps like this, just to make sure it stays closed and protected. This is a fairly plain binding to carry around with you, but it's a great example of that early chain that you would be able to attach. Sorry, lost my place for a second. So we're going to go to this other miniature book. The spine here says Mopsy. And one of the fantastic things about this practice of people binding books after they've already bought the text is you get a lot of personalization. We think that Mopsy may have been a nickname for the owner who bought this because it doesn't seem to relate to the title in any way. Again, you have this nice small bound book with this really great clasp. You have the gilt edges, so that gold there that's been applied to the edge of the pages. And it's hard to see, there we go, but you have a name engraved on the inside of this clasp, Ian Wallig. And so you could even further personalize your books, through the hardware, through putting, your name on the spine, and just doing a lot of different things to make this book exactly your own and personal and special just for you. So I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead a couple centuries to the time when it was no longer the only option to be able to bind your books yourself. So the Industrial Revolution changes book production in a lot of different ways because there's a lot of different technologies, but also the Industrial Revolution brings about more disposable income and more leisure time for learning and for reading. And so you have a larger portion of people who are able to access books and afford books, in addition to more technologies so that you can produce books more cheaply. And so you get, I think, what Eugene Field was complaining about in terms of, these paper-bound books, which are not very stable and they fall apart fairly easily, but they're also not always very pretty. My favorite example of this is actually from Charles Dickens. And this is Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers in what's referred to as the fascicles. So when Dickens was writing and publishing, he was doing it serially. Every week or so, a new episode, if you want to call it that, would come out, just in these cheap blue paper wrappers. And you would buy one and wait for the next one to come out, just like we do on television today. So this is the start of cliffhangers. I know that people were reading these, just waiting for the next one to come out. You can't wait to see what happens. Dickens was also paid by the word, so you can kind of see some of the stories and how they get a little bit long sometimes, just like they're trying to keep it going. But this was a very common way in the 19th century to produce new texts. And so they would come out like this. This is also a great way for sharing, because once you're done with the first fascicle, you can pass it on to a friend and start the second one and kind of share a lot more easily different parts of the text than you would be able to if this was bound as a single book. What you were supposed to do after you collected all the fascicles was go to your binder and have them bound like this. So this is a fairly standard binding from this time period. You've got, this is called a quarter leather spine, because you've got the cloth here and then the leather on the spine and the corners. Makes a nice decoration, but it's a little bit cheaper than using full leather. And then you can see this really nice gold tooling that allows us to get the publication, place and date, Dickens, the title, and all of that information. And so this is how you would bind those fascicles together into a book. So it's very rare to find those fascicles still in their original condition. In order to do the gold tooling, what you would do is take a really thin piece of gold leaf. It's so thin that like you can do a little magic trick. If you go like this with it, it just completely disappears. There's very little gold there because it's so thin, but you take a heated tool and you press that into the leather, which makes this really fantastic design. And a nice decoration just to pretty up the book a little bit. And then again, we have the gold on the edges of the paper. Nice and shiny. So I was very excited to find that we have quite a bit of Eugene Field in the collections here at Wash U. So the next set of books I'm going to show you were owned by him. I just really like the title of this one, The Evil Genius. This is what is referred to as a publisher's cloth binding. And this is when we start getting books that were bound by the publisher themselves. And so every book in that edition would have the same binding rather than people going into the store, buying an individual stack of pages and putting on different bindings based on their own finances and styles. So I still find publisher's bindings incredibly pretty. You can see here on the back, kind of, it's a little hard to see, but you have the same design in blind that you have in black on the front with Eugene Field's autograph. So this is a book he owned and probably read. And publisher's cloth bindings can get rather intricate and beautiful depending on how many colors are being used. They can use gold just as well as the leather. The color is not quite showing up right on the camera in this one. It's more of a grass green in person, but just really beautiful again. And this one was given to Mrs. Eugene Field and then bought by William K. Bixby, who was a big donor to many of the institutions in the area, including Wash U and Field House. So just because a book was bound in a pretty publisher's cloth binding doesn't mean that it stayed in that binding. So we have a couple of books that were owned by Eugene Field that were later rebound by the collector George Meissner, who apparently collected some of Field's books, and then he was one of the founding donors to the library's special collections here at Wash U. And I love this binding on the Angler's Souvenir. You've got this nice fish motif going on in gold. This is leather known as Morocco, which is very heavily dyed leather that has a really great color. It's usually goat skin. And then you can see there's also some red that's been applied. And so that is leather that has been onlaid on top of the other leather. And to do that, you have to cut the leather incredibly thin, which requires a lot of skill to be able to cut it that thin and not puncture through. You also have this really fantastic turn-ins and these silk end papers with Eugene Field's book plate just kind of laid in and no longer attached. But what Meissner would do when he was having a book rebound is he would take the old binding, the original publisher's cloth binding, and have it bound in the end so that we can still see what it would have originally looked like when Eugene Field owned it. So I believe this would be the front cover, and we have the spine here. And the reason that I think that this was done by George Meissner and not by Eugene Field himself is because of this copy that says Eugene Field's copy. So Meissner prized Field so much as a book collector and as a bibliophile that he wanted to honor Eugene Field by putting his name on this Jumping Frog by Mark Twain, which again has these leather onlays, the beautiful gold tooling, these really fabulously marbled end papers that I just absolutely adore. And again, that original publisher's cloth binding bound at the back, so you could still see what that original binding was. So a little bit more about binding history. A lot of people up until fairly recently considered the binding to be separate from the book. And that is because of this practice where people would go choose their own binding and they would have things rebound. And so you never knew what the original binding might have been or who did it. And so people were like, oh, well, that's a separate thing. Art historians can study that. We don't study that as part of books. We just study the text. Thankfully, this has been reversed because the binding can tell us a lot about the owners, how it was used, and how it was prized. Like I was talking about with some of those earlier books, we can tell that somebody without a lot of money owned those limb vellum books with those recycled covers, whereas we can tell that an institution owned the chained binding, because it's very unlikely that you would have an individual chaining their books to the shelves. They wouldn't be allowing people in to see those books. So for George Meissner to have these original covers bound in the back, it's really helpful for us to be able to see what it originally looked like and then what he decided to do with it. So, in this late 19th, early 20th century time period, where you have this explosion of books thanks to industrialization, disposable income, new printing methods and techniques, we really refer to this as the Gilded Age of book collecting. And there's so much collecting going on. Eugene Field is writing about it. He's doing his own collecting. There's also a lot of book binding going on. And this is, again, that practice of rebinding books beautifully, because there's this idea that if the text is really important, the book should be just as beautiful as the text is important. Also, this idea of I'm going to display my wealth on my bookshelves because you can display your wealth and your intelligence, just like people would do carrying their prayer book on their belt, walking around town. So you get this explosion of different fine bindings done by various people, sometimes firms, sometimes individuals. And so I want to talk about a few of those. Let's start with my favorite and one of our local binders, Cordelia Baker. Cordelia Baker was a wealthy St. Louisan, and she didn't get married young, and so she had some extra time on her hands and decided to take up bookbinding. And she actually traveled to England and apprenticed with T.J. Cobden Sanderson, who ran the Doves Press. And was a big figure in the arts and crafts movement, which again is kind of bringing about some of these binding techniques and this wish for really beautiful books. And then she came back to St. Louis and brought her binding skills with her. And so we have quite a few bindings that she produced in the collections, but she also taught bookbinding here at WashU in what is now referred to as the Sam Fox School. So this is a fairly simple binding. In terms of being a fine binding done by hand, but you have this beautiful Morocco and this really fantastic marbled paper and the gold tooling on the spine with the title and date, hand and soul. Those end papers are just lovely. And this one is a little fancier, but again, a really beautiful leather. And this one has the heavier gold tooling with this motif and design that's carried onto the spine and the back. And this was given to Cordelia Baker by T.J. Kopp and Sanderson. And I love this one especially because you have the edges, which are done in gold, called gilt edges, but they are also, there's a design that's been pressed into each of the edges, and that's referred to as goffered or gophered. There are 2 official pronunciations and 3 official spellings of this term. I think nobody was able to agree, but I think we can all agree that it's rather pretty in its effect. And just a little bit of extra that you can do to make your book really pretty. So for a bit of a different style, we are going to go to a Danish book designer, Thorvald Vindical. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. And he was part of a bookbinding competition that he was able to win because his bindings are so beautiful. Now, they were mostly executed by somebody other than him. So he was doing the design and somebody else was actually doing the binding. But you can see this one, again, has a beautiful design and these gilt patterns. And then this red onlay, which is a little hard to see against the brown, but it has a nice subtle effect that I really like. And again, these gilt edges. I'm not entirely sure how he got the gold to stand out like it does in this pattern, but I really love it. And a fantastically marbled end paper. And the gilt edges go all the way around. So another design by Vindical. And here you have these leather inlays. And so that is a process similar to onlays, where onlay you make the leather really thin and put it on top. The inlay, you actually cut out the background leather, make the other leather very thin and lay it inside. And you can kind of just tell by how it feels, whether it's an onlay or an inlay. But again, a very intricate, very difficult process to do, and done really beautifully in this example. And again, those gophered gilt pages. And fantastic end papers. I always consider the end papers to be part of the binding because that's done in that same process. You can see the motif on the edges matches with the end papers. There are also a lot of different binding firms that are working around the same time. So Zanesdorff is one of my favorites just because it has a really fun name to say, and they do really beautiful bindings. So this is a fairly plain but beautifully done binding from Zanesdorff. It's appearing a little bit more like blue on the screen. In person, it's got a little bit of a teal greenish hint to it, but nice and simple. If you ever wanted to know how to spell Zanesdorff, you can barely see it there, but I'd be happy to type it out for you later. And a simple but effective and beautiful book. So similar to one of the ones done by Cordelia Baker, just this repeated pattern. And this one was again done by Zanesdorff, and it has these silk end papers and William Bixby's book plate, which I think is one of the best book plates that was ever designed. This octopus is just so fantastic and so good with these books introduced in there. But I love the use of the silk end papers. And I'm just going to keep getting fancier as we go along. So this is a book that has different colors of leather with, you have some blind stamping as well as the gold tooling. This was done by Revere and Sons, which is another famous book firm. Again, just really beautiful examples. And this text is from 1632. So this was a case in which an owner or a seller took this older book that was probably in a binding that was falling apart or maybe not as pretty as they wanted, and rebound it to be something more of a showpiece that you could put on your shelves and really, show off to your friends and visitors. Okay, so from there, I'm going to set up a cradle. And this is always hard to do live on screen, so I hope you're going to bear with me just a little bit, because I want to talk about parts of bindings that can be difficult to see and you may not notice right away. So this is a beautiful Morocco binding, again, that heavily dyed leather, and looks fairly simple. Until you realize that there's a 4-edge painting. And this is the part that's hard. But when you bend the pages in a certain way, there's a painting revealed. And so it's a nice little secret. You can kind of see it just a little bit, but you don't really get the full effect until you have bent the pages in the correct way. And here you have a nice boating scene on the water. So we have about a dozen 4-edge paintings in our collection. And I pulled just a couple for you today. So again, really beautiful binding. And here you have a manor house 4-edge painting. It's actually pretty easy to see and disappears almost completely. Often when you have a 4-edge painting, the painting will tie into the book in some way. So this book is Seasons. And here you have a hunting scene, possibly for hunting season. And this one's from 1821. And then, as if these weren't fancy enough, this one gets even fancier with a battle scene that goes both ways. So this is a double 4-edge painting in which on the one side, I think this is after the battle, and on this side you have before the battle. So you're able to do before and after scenes if you were very skilled. I had never actually seen this book until I was playing around in the vault yesterday. And I just absolutely love that you have this vellum that's been heavily gold tooled with a leather onlay spine, but then has this pen and ink drawing done on the front that is just incredibly detailed and wonderful, with silk end papers. And there we go. Anne Hathaway's cottage depicted on the 4-edge painting, but also depicted in pen and ink here on the back. So you just have all of these types of decorations coming together and creating this really dynamic, beautiful piece. Unfortunately, it's been rubbed a little bit, but we now have it protected, so that won't continue to happen. And of course, this is the works of Shakespeare, hence Shakespeare on the front and Anne Hathaway's cottage on the 4-edge and the back. Okay, so I promised we were going to keep getting more ridiculous. And we're just going to keep going fancier and fancier. Actually, I'm going to go with this one real quick. So one of the things that became fairly popular in the 19th century, but was also used beforehand, were these silver bindings. And you can see this absolutely gorgeous silver filigree that is actually like a little binding cover. So your book would go inside it, and you have this clasp to keep it shut. And then because this book wasn't decorated enough, you have this really gorgeous leather, heavily gold-tooled slipcase, and then you get to the actual miniature book, which is an almanac, and just so beautifully decorated. Almanacs, especially miniatures like this one, were meant to be carried around. So if you're going to have it on you at all times, you might as well have something really beautiful that's really protective. So going back to one of our bigger books, if you particularly love an author, you can do what's known as a causeway binding, in which you have this leather and then a cutout for this portrait that's set inside of it to honor that author. Unfortunately, you can see we have a little bit of water damage on the silk file end papers, but you have this really gorgeous turn in and this just absolutely ridiculously wonderful painting of Keats. Oh, sorry, this one's Shelley. Then you have him on the back here as well. And you can see here it says causeway binding invented by J.H. Stonehouse. So you even have some of the history of this binding inscribed on the binding itself. So this is our Keats one. Yep, just checking myself. So we have another causeway style binding in which you get this portrait with these lovely silk end papers and the turn-ins with heavily gilt, but also you have pearls and gemstones. Because just a portrait of Keats wasn't enough, you want to go even further and add actual gemstones to your book. This is from, I'm trying to remember, 1818. At least the book was printed then. My guess is that it was bound a little bit later, by about a century or so. So late 19th, early 20th century, when these treasure bindings become very popular. But treasure bindings aren't new to this time period. Back when women were wearing books of hours hung from their belt, they would often have those with gemstones and jewels. As you can imagine, they didn't tend to last very long, mainly because people took them apart in order to get those gemstones back. But they still exist in other libraries, and we're quite fortunate to have a couple of jeweled bindings such as this. So the gemstones here, I believe, are garnet. And again, just really gorgeously done leather work with several different colors of leather. These beautiful gems that sparkle and heavy gold tooling. Yeah, and this design on the back is just so pretty. And this is The Princess by Alfred Lord Tennyson. You've got the gilt and goffered edges. Then you have this full leather end page. And this is done by Zanesdorff and Sutcliffe, which is another very famous fine binder of this time period. But the swallow is just exquisitely done. And silk end papers. So not a particularly gorgeous book in terms of its printing, but absolutely gorgeously bound. And our last jeweled binding of the day is this one, which I think is my favorite of the jeweled bindings, just because the design is so pretty. The gems are so sparkly. You got some mother of pearls, some sapphires, looks like some rubies, lots of different colors of leather work. Those patterns are replicated on the back without gems, so it can lay nice and flat against the table. Again, by Zanesdorff and Sutcliffe. But one of the reasons I love this one so much is because it is an illuminated manuscript. And so in a time period in 1910, where we have plenty of access to lots of different printing techniques, people decided that they wanted to do this one completely by hand. And so this is entirely a manuscript with this really heavy gold that you can see glittering and shining here, and these beautiful paintings throughout. So a binding just as beautiful in this case as the inside was created. So that's kind of the end of my historic binding examples. I wanted to touch on some of our newer bindings in the collection, and those are mostly from our artist books. I do want to say there are still fine binders who are working and doing these same techniques and really beautifully. But for the next short section, I want to talk about some of our books from our artist book collection where bindings are done in different and unique ways in order to change the way we interact with the book. So I explained when we first started about the codex and how it has a cover with pages in between. And there are many different ways that you can do a codex. This one is called Accordion Fold, where it's literally just accordion folded. And this one was created for display. So you actually have magnets here in the covers so that you can display it as a star. And if you're working with an exhibit in a case, you can show off more of the book than you would be able to if it was more of a traditionally bound codex where you're only able to open one spread at a time. So I just love that the artist, thought about the display and how people might be able to look at it or interact with it. So this is another accordion fold. So you can see how it just kind of, comes out in that traditional accordion fold with these really beautiful printed and hand-colored illustrations. But the reason that I love the binding on this book so much is that the accordion fold allows you to see the illustrations in a new light. So you can see you have pages of text in between, but the accordion fold allows you to see that this illustration is actually continuous throughout the text. Every time you find something in your color scheme, they match. And so there's these two different color schemes, and you can look at the illustrations differently and look at this continuous story through these illustrations based on the way that this binding was created. This is probably one of the most difficult books to work with on camera, so be kind, please, because it is a puzzle. It's called The Heart Wants What It Wants, and if you put the box and the three different pieces together, you get this anatomical heart. But you also have this weird and kind of difficult to open full page. Let me go back a little. that has the poem on it so that you're experiencing this book kind of as more of a poster or broadside than as your traditional book that you would flip through. And the folding it back up is the hard part. I've been practicing. And so each one of these three has a different poem with large scale illustration. And so this one is using several different binding techniques. So you have the accordion fold in the center, and then you have traditional binding on each side. And what this allows the book to do is change the way you read the poem based on what parts of the book you have open. So here we just have the three words, locus, home, known. And then as you flip through, you're revealing more. And you continue revealing more until you get to the center and the other side. And so where happiness could be is a thought, but you can see more kind of unraveling as you're flipping through this book in this unique way that it's bound. And this was done by Macy Chadwick, who is a professional book artist who graduated from WashU. So that's always really fun. Part of the reason I love this book so much is because it is so shockingly pink. It is very easy to find in the stocks. You just have to look at the right aisle and it kind of jumps out at you. Some might say it's aggressively pink. But this book is bound what's known as French door. And so it opens on either side. And so these erasure poems actually respond to each other. And you can flip through in different ways, looking at those different responses. It's also a flag book. So you can see it has this accordion fold, so it can splay out or come closer. So this is a small sample of our artist book collection. We have quite a large collection of artist books. Thanks to our artist book program at WashU, we collect a lot of student work, but we also collect work in order to teach classes for our artist book students. Again, very small portion of what we have in the collections, and I would be happy to talk more in general about the collections or answer specific questions if I'm able about bookbinding or the books that I've shown today. So we have plenty of time for questions, and yeah, hopefully I'll be able to answer all of them. One of the questions that I get most often is WashU open and accessible to the public? Normally, yes. During the pandemic, we are very restricted, and so we are offering only virtual appointments for now, unless you are a WashU student or a faculty or staff member. But when it is not a pandemic, we encourage anybody and everybody to come into the library and enjoy the books that we have. We have lots of exhibit spaces that are in normal times full of different parts of the collection with different themes. And you don't have to be a serious researcher with a PhD to be able to come into the reading room and enjoy the books that we have. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, Cassie. And before we get to questions real quickly, I do want to share a few more things about the Field House.
Oh, yes.
We do not have our books changed at all, so very thankfully. But if people are wanting to take a look at some of the books, they are free to come down. We are open for reservations. We have been affected by the pandemic as well, but we are here and we're open Wednesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. and Sunday from 12 to 4. We encourage, like I said, we encourage reservations, and if anybody wants to take a closer look at the things within our Glite collection in which we house our Morocco bindings. This is Love Affairs of the Bibliomaniac from that 12-volume set. But they can take a closer look at that as well as the other books we have on display in our exhibits. We are open for research as well. We really do ask that people make an appointment. And so the last thing that I want to do before we get to the questions is just read two poems by Eugene Field that I think would really help really resonate with people that enjoy books. The first one is from a little book of Western verse, the Bibliomaniac's Prayer. Keep me, I pray, in wisdom's way, that I may truth's eternal seek. I need protecting care today. My purse is light, my flesh is weak, so banish me from my erring heart. All baleful appetites and hints of Satan's fascinating art, of first editions and of prints, direct me in some godly walk, which leads away from bookish strife, that I, pious deed and talk, may extra illustrate my life. But if, O Lord, it pleases thee to keep me in temptation's way, I humbly ask that I may be most notably beset today. Let my temptation be a book which I shall purchase, hold, and keep, whereon when other men shall look, will wail to know I got it cheap. Oh, let it such a volume be as in rare copper plates abound, large paper, clean and fair to see, uncut, unique, unknown to Loundus. I don't know if I pronounced that last word right.
That's fantastic, though.
Yeah. And then this last one is actually from The Love Affairs of a Bibliomaniac. This was, as the story goes, the last book that Eugene actually worked on, and it is the story from birth to death of someone who extremely loved to collect books and cared for them greatly. And it's a really fun read to go through and just look at all the books that are mentioned, from Pilgrim's Progress to people that have just been lost to time. And so from there, I'm going to read the poem that doesn't really have a title, but my garden aboundeth in pleasant nooks, and fragrance is all over it all, for sweet is the smell of my old books in their places against the wall. Here is a folio that's grim with age, and yellow and green with mold, and there's a breath of the sea on every page, and a hint of a staunch ship's hold. And there is a charger from France La Belle, exhaleth a faint perfume of wedded lily and asphodel in a garden of song abloom. And this wee little book of Puritan mine and rude conspicuous print hath the Yankee flavor of wintergreen or maybe of peppermint. In Walton the books of babbling tell where the cheery daisy grows, and where in meadow of woodland dwell the buttercup and the rose. The best beloved of books, I ween, are those which one perceives are hovered by ash and dropped between the yellow well-thumbed leaves. For it is here a laugh and it's there a tear, till the treasured book is read, and the ashes betwixt the pages here tell us of one long dead. But the gracious presence reappears as we read the book again, and the fragrance of precious distant years filleth the hearts of men. Come pluck with me in my garden nooks the posies that bloom for all, oh sweet is the smell of my old books in their places against the wall. So I thought those two were very fitting.
They're fantastic, and apparently I need to add more Eugene Field to my reading list.
I really do recommend The Love Affairs. It's very much just someone going on and on and on about books in a way that anybody who loves books will understand even 100 or so more years later.
That sounds so perfect for me.
And we have a couple of questions here. So what are books of hours that you mentioned before?
Yes. I forgot to explain. Books of hours are a religious genre that is used kind of in the medieval period, and they were created for lay people, so not the clergy or people working in the religion, but for kind of your everyday person, and when I say everyday, I mean incredibly rich everyday person, the 1% of the 1% would be able to afford these types of books. But it was a book that kind of told you what to pray and when. So it would usually start with a calendar so that you could like know when your feast days were, when the saints' days were, and they also included the hours of the Virgin, which is why they're referred to as books of hours. But this would be kind of your religious book that as a lay person who's not allowed to read and interpret the Bible, you would be able to take this home to do your daily prayers. They were often very, very highly decorated because they were manuscripts and everyone was written by hand. Sometimes you would have somebody incredibly rich commission one, and they themselves would be like, they would have a portrait of themselves in the illuminations, but lots of gold was used, lots of decoration, just a very beautiful genre.
Our next question, has anyone done any research on the manuscript bindings in your collections to identify them?
We have not yet, and if somebody would like to, I'd be happy to help you do that. I'd never seen that the one that I showed that hasn't been scraped away. I do believe it is printed waste. So it was from a printed book that was reused and recycled. And then the text that was printed was from the 17th century. So it was a little bit later. But yeah, I would love for somebody to do that kind of work. I know that there are scholars at other institutions who are doing really important work in what's called fragmentology, where they're trying to identify these different fragments of manuscripts, whether they are reused in bindings or just individual leaves that have been sold for decoration to hang around your house, that are trying to identify what those are and bring them back together to recreate those original manuscripts.
When it comes to binding, how would you know who the binder is if there's not like a plate or something and they're identifying it?
Some binders have really specific styles, but for the most part, binders will, especially your fine binders, they'll sign them on the inside of the front cover, and that's the main way we know. With the Thorvald Vindical, when I first got to WashU about 3 years ago, I got a reference request saying, like, we think you have some of this guy's bindings, can you check? And the way we were able to figure that out is because when he produced them, because it was part of a design binding competition, there were descriptions and photographs of the original bindings. And so I was able to match our bindings to those photographs. So sometimes you get lucky and have that kind of historic information. But a lot of times the people doing the binding are completely lost. And we just have no idea who they are, especially when the binders are women. So women did a lot of sewing of books, and then they would often hand that text block off to men to kind of do like the leather work and the more presentation stuff. But especially when you have multiple people like that working on bindings and in different pieces, those names get lost to history.
And if someone wanted to rebind something nowadays, who would they go to? Is there anyone here in St. Louis, or is there anyone that WashU works with?
Yeah, so I will say we don't rebind things anymore. And that is kind of a policy that we have in the library, and a lot of different libraries have that policy, because when you rebind something, you lose a lot of that history of that binding that I was talking about, where the binding can tell you a bit about like how much money the owner had, or how much they loved this book, and or what time period it was bound in. So you lose a lot of that information. So we do fairly conservative conservation and preservation. We put a lot of things in boxes. We stabilize and fix bindings without replacing them. And all of that is fully documented, so we know exactly what was done before it got to WashU and what we did to it now. That's not to say that there aren't binders out there. There is somebody in St. Louis, Noah Smuts, who is a trained conservator. And all conservators know how to do bindings, and so he would certainly know how to do that. He is the only person I know of in St. Louis. But there are also, as I said, a lot of fine binders still working today. So if you wanted to take a book and have it done with like a gorgeous leather, gold tool, even add gems, there are people who still know how to do that and could do that. It would just cost a lot if you're going to use diamonds.
Let's see. If anybody else also has any questions, feel free to type them into the Facebook comments and we'll make sure to get to them. Another question we have is, in your bio, it says you worked with things that are from 3000 BC. What exactly is that?
So we have, I think, 4 or 5 cuneiform tablets in the collection. So not a very large collection of items that are that early, but we do have examples. Cuneiform being the earliest writing system from around 3000 BC. I cannot read them. And they're small. Many of them were given to us by Julian Edison, who collected miniature books, some of which you saw today. So they're rather small and they're rather boring text. They're mostly like tax receipts because they're very transactional. That's what you were writing all the way back in 3000 BC, just keeping track of things, not a whole lot of stories. Although there is a cuneiform tablet that is a complaint against a merchant, so your earliest Yelp review, basically. So those are our earliest things. We also have around 450 fragments of papyrus, which is a really great collection that again is kind of one of those earlier collections before we get to that first codex that I showed from around 1275. That's kind of our earliest book, depending on what you think a book is and what counts or not.
Okay. And while we wait to see if while we're waiting to see if any more questions come in, I know a big thing in WashU recently was the finding of a copy of the Declaration of Independence. And you had a big part in, I think, what was it, a permanent display now exhibit of it?
Yeah,
yeah,
the Declaration is so exciting to have, and it's so funny. They didn't tell me about it during my interview. And so my first day on the job, my boss was like, "Hey, do you want to see the Declaration of Independence?" I was like, "Wait, what?" Like, what did you forget to tell me about? And it's become quite a large part of my job because it's such an important piece of history. And it is now on permanent display. It was donated by Andy Newman in 2015. And it was kept very quietly in an unmarked box in the vault until we were able to, as part of our library transformation, build a dedicated exhibit space specifically for the Declaration of Independence. So if you do come into the Olin Library on Zanesdorff campus, on the main floor, there's a Declaration chamber. And in very large letters on the outside, it says the Declaration. There's these beautiful glass doors with the text of the Declaration on it. And it's created so that when you walk in, it's quite dim, so that there's no fading of the document. It has its own temperature and humidity control system so that we can keep it out long term. With the pandemic and nobody being allowed in the library, we have put it back in the vault to rest. So it can be, temperature and humidity stable, but also completely dark, which will allow us when we reopen again to be able to display it for longer. We also have a side case that we do rotating exhibits about the Declaration of Independence and other famous events in history related to the Declaration, as well as a digital display where you can kind of learn more and see the back. But it's a really fabulous document to be able to have. I've learned so much about American history through working with it and working with field trips who have come to see it, as well as doing talks and tours and our annual 4th of July event that we have the day before because we're closed on the 4th.
Great. Is there any events or anything coming up? I know just recently you did, what was it, miniature book exhibit, or not exhibit, a presentation?
Yeah,
Anything else like that planned for the future?
So many of them. I love doing events because, you know, as you shared in my bio, my favorite part of the job is sharing the collections with others. And since we're closed, I'm doing all of that virtually. And it's just a great way for me to be able to like get my hands on the books and learn about them and then share my favorites. Yeah, so I just recently did, I think it was in November, a talk on our miniature book collection that was donated by Julian Edison. Um, Upcoming this semester, I'm doing talks on kind of a very brief, broad overview of history of the book, which will probably include some of the ones I showed today too, at least that chain binding. That one comes out because it's just so good. And then I'm also going to do a little bit later, I think in June, I'm doing a talk on our pop-up book collection and our movable books, which is really fun. Just to see like all of that paper engineering and how they're put together, but also like early turning wheels that help with code breaking from the 16th century, and just all of these different movable books. My colleagues also do talks, so definitely look out for those. You can find all of our events on the library website, which is library.wustl.edu. That's WUSTL. And then me and some colleagues also run a book club. We're meeting, I think it's January 20th is our next meeting. And each month we read a different book related to the collections. And we do kind of a short presentation similar to what I did today, but much, much shorter before we discuss the book that we all read. All of our events are free and open to the public.
That sounds wonderful. Sounds like you have a lot going on in the future. So that looks like it about wraps it up. So thank you again for joining us, and for everyone who has enjoyed the speaker series here with the Fieldhouse Museum and the books. We do have a speaker next month on February 25th at 7 p.m. We're going to be hosting Sharon Giesfeld Van Rooswick, who is a miniature book artist, and she's going to be actually showing us the process of how to make a miniature book. As well as discussing what goes into making the dollhouse size ones. So the teeny tiny ones that are like the size of your finger. But yeah, we are really excited and really thankful that you were able to join us today. So thank you again, and stay safe in this coming year.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.